Okay, so we're now moving into the next item. Sorry, it's item number 6 on your agenda there. It's equality for all customers of the Department of Social Protection, transgender recognition. I'd like to welcome the Transgender Equality Network Ireland, or TENI, to our meeting today to discuss with us their experience of equality of treatment at the Department of Social Protection. I'd like to welcome Broden Giambrone, TENI Director. So I'm going to ask the groups to make the presentation.
Thank you so much. I want to start off by thanking Ms. Joanna Tuffy for the invitation to address you all, and for all of you who could join us today to discuss this very important issue. And we're looking forward to the opportunity to ask questions and get into the issues in more detail. So I'm going to provide a bit of a background, and then I'm going to have my colleagues speak a bit more to the substantive issues, and we're going to end with Tanya speaking a bit about the legal side. So we'll just get to it. Transgender or trans people are some of the most vulnerable members in Irish society and experience high levels of stigmatisation and marginalisation. The research out there shows that trans people have some of the highest levels of suicidality, experience regular harassment and violence, and also systemic discrimination. In Ireland, a major contributing factor to this marginalisation of trans people is that there's no state recognition of trans identities. The legal gender recognition would provide a process for an individual to change their gender marker on their birth certificate. And this is important because birth certificates are foundational documents. They're necessary for things such as your PPS or to get married. And in the situation we're currently in, many trans people may be able to change certain identification documents like a passport or driver's license into their preferred gender, but they're unable to change their birth certificate. And that can have a huge impact because it can lead to them being outed when they're applying for jobs, going to university, any time where you might need to show a piece of identification. So this puts an individual at risk, and it also can lead to a denial of services and restrict an individual's ability to travel domestically or internationally. Ireland is one of the few remaining countries in the European Union that doesn't allow for the legal recognition of trans people. This is despite a High Court ruling in 2007 that found the state to be in breach of its positive obligations under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, or ECHR, in failing to recognize Dr. Lydia Foy in her female gender and to provide her with a new birth certificate. This was the first declaration of incompatibility to be made under the ECHR Act, and we still haven't acted. So in May 2010, the Irish government set up the Gender Recognition Advisory Group. We're going to refer to it as the GREG, which was the interdepartmental working group. And the remit of this group was to advise the Minister for Social Protection on the legislation required to provide for legal recognition by the state of the acquired gender of transsexuals. So that was broadly what they were tasked to do. And what they did then was, through consultation and research, the group outlined a legal pathway and qualification criteria for legal gender recognition. It's important to say, though, that the proposed qualification criteria for the Irish legislation is very much borrowed from the UK's Gender Recognition Act in 2004. The criteria will include a requirement that applicants be 18 years of age or older, a formal diagnosis of gender identity disorder, or GID, plus relevant medical evidence, and the requirement that an individual not be an existing valid marriage or civil partnership. Applicants would also be required to apply to a 3-person independent panel. We feel quite strongly that the proposed qualification criteria for gender recognition are highly restrictive and clearly infringe on an individual's right to privacy, personal dignity, and family life. The process is discriminatory and will cause serious hardships for individuals and their families. One of the proposed requirements is that the individual will need a formal diagnosis of GID, as I said, or undergone gender reassignment surgery. And just to give a little bit of background, gender identity disorder is a diagnosis that, and it's found in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So people are required to have a diagnosis of GID from this particular manual from medical professionals in Ireland. If this diagnosis of GID is used, it will be exclusionary for individuals who either cannot or choose not to undergo medical interventions or get a diagnosis of a mental illness. A diagnosis of GID also excludes people who are intersex, many of whom would benefit enormously from being able to access gender recognition legislation. I also just wanted to sort of update the committee and say that the term gender identity disorder, while it's used throughout the Gregg report, is now being removed from the DSM, or the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it's actually being replaced by gender dysphoria. That means that, should we put this in, we would actually be enshrining an obsolete term. The second major difficulty in the proposed legislation is the requirement to exclude people who are in existing marriages or civil partnerships. The GRAG has based their recommendations, as I said, on the UK model, which provides an informal fast track. So in the UK, marriage and civil partnership are afforded much the same rights. In Ireland, it's quite a different situation. So in the UK, married couples can get a divorce and change that over to a civil partnership within 48 hours. And so no one needs to know that the family's been broken up, that nobody needs to move out of the home, and children don't need to know anything about it because it's able to shift over very quickly. In the Irish context, it's very different. Couples must have no prospect of reconciliation and must be living apart for 4 years to get a divorce. So couples who wish to stay together, people who are in happy marriages, would have to lie in court to access a divorce if one of them wanted to have their gender recognized. And clearly this would have a devastating effect on an individual's family. So it is vital that legislation that is introduced is firmly grounded in a rights-based model that is inclusive, progressive, and marriage-friendly. We only need to look to the south, to Argentina. They recently introduced a gender recognition bill, and that was passed in May. And in Argentina, the criteria for changing your gender is simplified. It's based on self-determination. There is no need for an individual to prove that they have had surgical procedures, hormonal therapy, or other psychological or medical treatments, such as a diagnosis of mental illness. This law clearly separates a legal right from medical interventions. Ireland has the potential to be the first country in Europe to introduce legislation that truly respects the rights and privacy of transgender people, and we must not miss that opportunity. Thank you.
What we would do out of this meeting is we would, possibly make recommendations to the Minister. Just to make that point. And similarly with the group, the Gender Recognition Advisory Group, that was a group that was set up by the Minister, so it would be up to her if she wanted to do anything like that.
Great, thank you. I wanted to go back to your question briefly around numbers, and I won't get into it too much. I would say it's difficult for us to estimate how many transgender people there are in Ireland. There's lots of reasons for this. Lots of people don't come out. There's no formal process, so we can't say for sure, certainly. However, what we would say is that over the last year, over 600 people have reached out to TENI through our support and information line. In 2011, we know 300 people went to different support groups throughout Ireland. And the kind of figures in Scotland is the way they deduct broader transgender populations is that they assume that for every person who goes to a support group, you can multiply that by 10. So in any case, we are looking at thousands of transgender people. And I would also say that as Irish society is becoming more open and is becoming more inclusive, more and more people come out. So anecdotally, we know over the last few years, each year we're being contacted more and more, and new groups are being contacted and the support groups are being accessed. So I would say it's going to become even more of an issue as time goes by. The other issue that you raised in terms of the GRAG being disbanded and potentially bringing it back, certainly that's under the Minister's remit. I don't know. I would say, though, one of our concerns would be about the delay. So a lot of these issues that we're speaking about today were raised during that process, during the submissions process. And I think if you look at, and if you read through the GRAG report, the voices that come across most strongly are much more the medical experts, so the psychiatrists who put in submissions. And you don't really hear the voices of trans people and their experiences, which was one of the reasons we wanted, to have Darren and Victoria here to speak to that as well, because those are such important voices. This is the legislation that's going to affect people's lives. So I think that, a lot of those issues were raised through the submissions process, both written and oral, and yet they didn't make it into the GREG. So I would just caution that that's the danger, that again, we're delayed. It's been 5 years since Dr. Ford won her case, and still we're waiting. So that would be the challenge. In terms of just an addition to the issue unsure around the time frame. The Minister did speak at the 4th European Transgender Council that TENI held in September. This was the largest conference for transgender people in Europe. It was quite a big event for us. And she did speak, and she did indicate that this legislation would come before this committee and there would be those opportunities. So, you know, we would be more than happy to come back at a later date when that is coming up, because certainly there are more issues to raise and there will be a lot of issues, legal issues to tease out. There will also be a Shannon debate. Senator Catherine Depone requested one. It was scheduled initially for this year at December, January, but unfortunately I think that's been pushed. We don't have the date, but I assume that will be another opportunity for us to tease out some of these issues.